I think it's fair to say the nation is in an anxious mood these days, thanks to a pretty grim news cycle. Less than 3 weeks to go until voters go to the polls. Republicans are doing their best to make the midterms a fear election. If you want to get a sense of the climate on the right, look no further than this highly scientific poll from Fox News, or this one, the 1-2 punch of threats facing America. Indeed, those two supposedly imminent threats have become the dominant themes of the GOP campaign. For weeks now, Republican candidates and groups have been running ads, play up the ISIS menace, and portray Democrats as weak on security. Just today, a super PAC called Secure America Now, finally took down a series of ads showing American journalist James Foley in the moments before he was murdered.
While radical Islamists threaten to attack America and millions cross our border undetected, President Obama and Senator Shaheen have done nothing.
The group initially refused to pull the ads and only took the video down after Foley's parents publicly objected.
I think deplorable, and I think there should be an apology.
It makes me very sad that people would use the brutality of our son's death for their own political purposes.
Now that Ebola is grabbing the headlines, it's become fodder for conservatives seeking to capitalize on the public's anxiety. At least 6 Republican Senate candidates have made Ebola a campaign issue, calling for a travel ban and blasting the president and his party for letting the virus spread. But the real creative thinkers in the Republican Party, the ones breaking new intellectual ground, are those bringing all these themes together in a kind of unified theory of fear. People like Congressman Mike Kelly of Pennsylvania and Joe Wilson of South Carolina linking Ebola, terrorism, and the GOP's favorite bugaboo, the border.
We have American citizens who have left our country and gone to other parts of the world to learn how to do horrible things. Come back home, blow themselves up in a mall, and take lives. Think about the job they could do, the harm they could inflict on the American people by bringing this deadly disease into our cities, into our schools, into our towns, and into our homes.
The creed of Hamas. We value death more than you value life. What? That's their creed. Okay, well, part of their creed would be to bring persons who have Ebola into our country. It would promote their creed. And so it's, and all of this could be avoided by sealing the border properly, thoroughly. Come on.
Calling this phenomenon threat clue. It was ISIS with the Ebola on the southern border. Joining me now is retired U.S. Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff, Secretary of State Colin Powell. Colonel Wilkerson, I got to say, I understand politics, that people run ads. I was shocked that they would use the murder of this American in this ad in this way, and that it didn't actually even seem to precipitate much of a controversy.
You should be shocked. I was shocked, too. That said, this isn't anything new. Remember Joe McCarthy and the politics of fear of the Cold War in the 50s and his exploitation thereof. Fear is a human commodity that is very exploitable, and politicians will take advantage of any such commodity. And in this case, I think my party is running the gamut in terms of taking advantage of it. It's to be expected, I think. There's something about, obviously, we're in a very different place as a nation than we were in the days after 9/11 for a variety of reasons. But there's something about the kind of atmosphere right now that reminds me a little bit of that period. And obviously, in that period, we were dealing with a genuinely terrifying, traumatic event. I mean, the murder of 3,000 of our fellow citizens, the fear that induced in people, I think completely reasonable, understandable fear, led to a kind of politics that produced a lot of terrible outcomes. And you sort of watched this play out. And I wonder what you think as you think about how Washington operates under conditions of fear. I did, Chris, and I have to say that the initial reaction was understandable and digestible. The reaction that began to happen, though, several weeks and even months afterwards, and now, as you've pointed out, for a decade plus, was not understandable and I think is reprehensible. Let's just face it. There's a reason to be scared of Ebola. There's a reason to be scared of the Islamic State forces and so forth. Fear is a justifiable commodity in that respect. But it is not justifiable in terms of the way it's being exploited. Statistically, Americans have just about as much chance of dying of a terrorist attack, or from Ebola for that matter, as they do a lightning strike. So I like what Dr. Berwick said earlier on your show. Very sane comments, very wise comments. I dealt with Ebola early on in the chairmanship of General Powell. A rhesus monkey from the Philippines had come in, and Ebola Zaire was the virus affected at that time. It had about an 88% lethality rate, and a young lieutenant colonel out at Fort Detrick tore her spacesuit in the Biolevel 4 facility there. And she continued throughout the quarantine period that she necessarily had to endure to do her work. And she did it well and courageously. That's the way the rest of us need to react. We're not a nation of cowards.
That is exactly right. And it strikes me so much how much the country that is the strongest, most powerful country in the world, the richest country in the world, the country with the biggest military. I just want us to be able to understand that, you know, we're going to be okay. And it's very hard. It's funny. You would think that there would be a market for that in politics, but there weirdly doesn't seem to be a market for it in politics. What there seems in politics to be a market for the opposite.
I think you're right. Karl Rove was right to a certain extent when he said, if we exploit this, we can be in power for a long time, meaning, of course, 9/11. He also said, if we believe Ron Suskind, I didn't hear him say this, but Ron Suskind reports that he did, that we're an empire, and when we act, our actions are the truth. Right. And so if politicians, if that's the case for a second, let's just say that's the case for a second. If my party wants to make the main reason for this empire's existence the politics of fear, I think that's reprehensible.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Just a factual note, I think the Ron Suskind quote that Mr. Wilkinson was referring to was off the record. I don't know if that source has ever been identified as a small factual note. All right. If you've been watching our coverage of the wild gubernatorial debates in Vermont this week, you'll know that politics is way more fun when everyone gets to play. Coming up next, the former governor of Vermont, Howard Dean, is back to break down and analyze this epic race and that epic hat. Then, a new contender for best political ad of the midterms.
I know black folks have had a hard time with slavery.
A brave white man like you might be just what we need to put an end to this political correctness stuff in America today.
That is not a spoof. More on the return of Clive and Bundy ahead.